Well, good evening and welcome to the first of our BRITPAC discussions. In this series of 6 programmes, we're going to be exploring how to uncancel Britain. We'll be discussing defence, national security, immigration, education, healthcare and the state of British politics, the lack of strategic vision and planning in government and in fact in all political parties, the lack of skills, knowledge and acumen in Parliament and what we, on the right of centre of British politics, think may be done about these things. We'll be talking about the damaging impact of wokism and the appalling suppression of ideas and the expression of opinions by those who believe that those opinions are not valid. We're going to discuss how we push back against what I can only call the anarchy of the left. In this introductory programme, we'll touch on many of these issues. Now, the death of Prince Philip might be argued to mark the passing of an era in which service to the greater good of the nation was considered by society to be a great deal more important than it is perhaps in today's more materialistic and insular, some might argue, self-centred world. In that context, and as we emerge from COVID and into a new post-Brexit era, who are we, the British people? We've seen a rise in identity politics, statues pulled down, students even told that spelling is no longer important, and soldiers instructed not to refer to themselves as lads. We've seen inequitable policing, unbalanced criticism of Britain's involvement in slavery, without any acknowledgement of the nation's role in ending it. Islamification is arguably on the rise. Our countryside is being concreted over, and the country that once stood alone against the Nazis is now seemingly unable to defend it and protect its shores from inflatable dinghies. Foreign cultures are arguably given more protection under law than our own. Extremists on the left and those who've made a career from creating identity-based divisions in our society outrageously suppress and deter the expression of opinions other than their own. So how do we actually see ourselves as a nation? What do we aspire towards? What are our values? How would we like the rest of the world to perceive us? And indeed, what should Britain's role in the world be? And how should all of this play into government policy as we emerge into that new era? It's perhaps time to uncancel Britain, cancel culture, and wake up to wokism. Joining me in the first of these inaugural BRITPAC debates to discuss these and perhaps some other issues are Charles-Henri Gallois, President of Generation FREXIT, and Roert Oulds, Director of the Conservative Eurosceptic group, the Bruges Group. So welcome to you both. Charles-Henri and Robert, could I, maybe starting with you, Charles-Henri, ask you to say a few words about Generation FREXIT? Who are you and what do you represent? What are your aims?
Thank you, Henry. Generation FREXIT is a French political movement, of course, that want Frexit. It has been created on July the 14th, which is a national day on French, the French National Day. So we are advocating for France to get a proper membership referendum on the European Union, basically the same referendum that you had back in 2016. So we are trying to do that because we think that it's the best strategy for France to get out of the European Union, because it's a very difficult thing to do through the presidential election, where the European Union is one topic within many others. And we believe that it's not, let's say, at the short term, it's not the easiest way to leave the European Union. So we are advocating and we are putting pressure to get this referendum. And basically, we have built a big petition in France, which is a referendum EU in French, UE.org. And we are building that thing and we are making it growing in order for France to have this debate, to have this referendum on whether or not we should be member of the European Union.
For the benefit of people listening, possibly the majority of whom are going to be here in the UK, so would it be fair to sum up what you've just said as and Generation FREXIT as the sort of French movement towards getting independence from the European Union? You're not affiliated specifically to a political party as such, sure are you?
It's a brand new political movement, and we are working with many political parties or politics that want to have this referendum. Basically, it's broader than only French politics, because we have many people across civil society that agree with us to get this referendum, because the idea is to say, of course, we want Frexit, but the EU membership has changed so much since the last one that we had, the Maastricht Treaty. It was the last referendum where the French had said yes, because back in 2005, we said no to the European Treaty, and we had the Lisbon Treaty. But after the Maastricht Treaty, you have all the euro currency purpose. They say that it will give more growth, less unemployment, and so on. We have 20 years now to see whether it's the case or not. You have, of course, the Nice Treaty, which has, let's say, enlarged the European Union across the eastern countries, which is a big difference in terms of competitivity, in terms of wages, in terms of immigration. You got also the Amsterdam Treaty in 1999, which gave the European Union all the immigration policy. You've got also the budget treaty in 2012 that gives many power to the European Union in terms of economic and social policy. So last time that we have voted for the European Union, but I was too young to vote actually, and I would have done it. But last time we have voted yes, the condition has changed so much that if you are a Democrat, whether or not you are for Frexit, whether or not you're from right wing or left wing, if you're a Democrat, as the condition has changed a lot, we need to have this referendum, and we need to let the French people decide if they want to stay in the European, because actually this question was never asked to French people. We never voted to enter in the European Union. In the UK, you had a vote to enter in the European Union, but in France, let's say the integration to the European construction, we never had any votes on it. We had only votes on whether we want a new treaty, but we had never the opportunity to have this vote. So that's what we are advocating for.
Of topical interest at the moment, perhaps, I mean, it would be your perception from France as to the impact of the European Union on the vaccination program. Of course, there are a lot of people who would argue that, COVID is not that much of a risk, and the vaccination program is all something to do with, governments trying to exert control over populations. But we're not going to go into that conversation. But from a French point of view, I'd be interested to know what you think. I mean, here in the UK, the perception is that we wouldn't have been able to have such a successful vaccination program had we been in the European Union still. What's your thought on that?
Totally right, because the UK had this very good vaccination rollout thanks to Brexit, because we know exactly what's happened and why France, Germany, or let's say all the European Union countries had this delay in vaccination program. We had some very interesting interviews by the CEO of Moderna, or the one of AstraZeneca. By the way, there are two French people. And what did they say? They say in the two interviews, they say, we had first, in 2020 spring, we had some very good negotiation with the French government in terms of economic proposal, in terms of, let's say, scientific purposes. Everything was on track. And then we don't know why it has been decided to give, let's say, the folder to the European Union, and we did not have any news of them only in the autumn 2020. So these 3 months of delay, that is the delay basically that we have in vaccination, because the UK had concluded the deal with AstraZeneca, with Moderna, 3 months before the European Union. Mm-hmm. And the CEO said it's because the European was very low, it's very bureaucratic, and this vaccination rollout, apart from COVID on healthy nation, it really explained why you need to be an independent country, because a sovereign independent country is much more quick, defends its self-interest, and at the end, eventually, is more efficient than the big bureaucracy, anti-democratic like the European Union, where you have only different national interests. So it's very slow, it's very inefficient, and the vaccination rollout has definitely highlighted this matter.
That's interesting. Thank you for that, Charles-Henri. Now, Robert, just briefly, the Bruges Group, what are you about?
Bruges Group is a think tank. We were founded in 1989 following a speech by Margaret Thatcher, who became our president. And we were there to really make the case that the European Union was going down the wrong path, and to put Margaret Thatcher's alternative vision for how things should be into the public debate. And in a sense, we are the common ancestor of all the other Eurosceptic groups. Before the formation of the Bruges Group, which did cause a real stir, there was very little discussion on the topic. We, in a sense, started this off and really made Brexit possible in the long run by putting the ideas out there, making the intellectual case for Britain being outside of a centralised European Union structure. And this was over a long period of time. From 1989, we've been working at this. Of course, myself, I've been involved in the Bruges Group since 2001. And many of the organisations have come out of us. Many of the ideas, what we understand to be of Euroscepticism, came from the work of the Bruges Group, which, in a sense, took British traditions, British interests, and what we actually want to see as a country, how we want to run our country, how the British people want to run their own affairs, and took them forward. And I saw, to come into your discussion about long-term trends and culture, I saw in the early noughties, in the early 2000s, that Britain, and I made this prediction, that Britain would leave the EU by the 1st of January 2020. I was wrong by a month or a year, depending upon how you look upon our exit, because I could see how events were developing. We saw how the Maastricht Treaty debates in the early 1990s really did transform the topic. And the thing is, the more people see about the European Union, the less they like it. Trying to convince people to support the European Union is actually very difficult. Those who do support it either don't understand it generally, or, of course, are in the pay of it. That was a political rule put out there by Christopher Booker, a very well-known Eurosceptic who's now since passed away, wrote for the Telegraph, as well as a number of other books, and very esteemed writer and a great intellectual, though not necessarily truly appreciated in his time. And the more people know about the European Union, the less they like it. And of course, if I may say, particularly about this vaccine debate, because even Michel Barnier has said that the European Union's chief negotiator over Brexit has actually said that Britain has got a vaccine programme superior to that of the European Union because we're outside of the European Union. The European Union is costing lives, it's damaging their economies, it's keeping them in lockdown, but the failure to get their vaccination programme underway properly is costing lives, and this is absolutely shameful. Everything the Eurosceptics have said, such as the Bruges Group, has been correct. Everything the Europhiles said has been wrong, or the implications of withdrawal. You name it, whatever the Europhiles said, they were wrong. And we need to remind them of that.
We could talk about this all night, I'm sure. We have left, and perhaps Charles-Henri can take away some of the things that you've just said, and maybe even link in with you as to sort of, how you might be able to sort of, provide him with some ammunition for their cause. But if we move on, I mean, we're really fundamentally here tonight to talk about where Britain is as we emerge from this post-COVID, particularly post-Brexit phase and into the future. One of the things that concerns me is, and we'll talk about this shortly, is that we lack a vision in the UK. We always have. It's been about leaving the European Union, and there's been justification as to why. But where are we? What's our destination after that? What are we trying to achieve? So the question I've got for you, Robert, and it's a big question I'm going to throw you. Who are we, the Brits, now, in the modern day? Honestly, how do you think that we see ourselves? What are our modern characteristics as a nation? What do you think?
Well, I would say we do have a vision. This might not be written down in one document, a bit like our constitution, but it's very much about how sort of George Orwell, I think he wrote in Notes on Nationalism, is that the culture will not change. And actually, national characteristics pretty much stay the same. And George Orwell is quite clear about this. Britain's culture, no matter what happens to our institutions, which may come and go, the culture will remain the same. And Britain has always had this tendency to be other than Europe. We didn't want to be part of it and to see ourselves as being international and global. And that's something which has been a characteristic of ours since at least the Elizabethan era, when, of course, the English Reformation and the reform of the church in the Elizabethan era actually sort of did have this break from Europe, and we had to look for trade elsewhere. But always we saw ourselves as more individualistic, less statist. That was something that's always been a character. But not wanting to partake in the European Union, for instance, and of course limited government as well. That's always been something which has existed, and the British people don't want to depart from that. And we saw a lot of the discussions during the Brexit debate where we were talking about leaving the European Union and going to the rest of the world, and of course being open to the rest of the world and having free trade. And this is another thing which is characteristic of people in the UK. There was over a century ago now, there was free trade halls established. There was an election in 1906 where the Liberals advocated free trade, and they won overwhelmingly. There are things which are deeply ingrained in the Britain psyche that remain with us to this day, and they may indeed go back to how Britain evolved during the medieval era. We see how the parts of the country that... Yeah.
Rob,
I see you want to interject.
If I may, yeah, all of the above I accept. I'm going to say shortly, I'm going to bring in a question and going to fire a question back to you in a minute. I'm going to go to Charles-Henri in a moment. But then I'm going to come back to you because whilst what you say may have been the case for centuries, I'm wondering whether the dynamic is changing. And I'll explain that concern, that suggestion in a minute. But Charles-Henri, I mean, we're a nation of immigrants, one could say, but with a very definite characteristics. And you've heard what Robert said, but there was perhaps a time, maybe it's just my perception, where if you mentioned the British around the world, it would conjure up a fairly common impression. You know, whether you were talking to somebody from Singapore or from Spain or from Greenland to Greece, you know, a cartoonist would draw a similar cartoon, and it might be a bloke in a bowler hat, pinstripe suit and carrying an umbrella, or it might be of a Royal Naval gunship sailing down somebody's river. Indeed, since the 13th century, there's been an expression, perfidious Albion, and I think it was particularly popular in France in the 19th century. You know, perfidious Albion, sort of meaning that, you know, Britain in terms of international affairs is always pursuing its own interests, and in that respect, it can be duplicitous and treacherous. You know, how well do you think sort of the idea of us Brits, of who we are, fits with the reality as perceived from France and from the rest of the world?
No, I have some, let's say, points in common with Robert. I think the first word that comes to me would be pragmatic. Maybe you can say perfid Albion, but it's not the pragmatic. And I think it has helped for Brexit because you looked at the figures, you look at what was imposed to you by the European Union. I think it's this pragmatic behavior that makes the British leave the European Union. You know, maybe sometimes the Latin countries like Spain, France, or Italy, they are more sometimes dogmatic. So they will stick to the idea, even if they see that the reality is wrong. They want to defend this idea. They want to defend what they fought for, what they have believed was okay. And they keep on, which can be a mistake, I think. then I also agree. We have many common features between the French and the Brit. I think we are much more closer than with the Germans, for example, because we share also this global view. Both have been great empires, open to the world with many exchanges. So we have this mentality also of global French with the Francophonie, with you, with the Commonwealth. I think we have this mentality. We also share in terms of individuality and freedom. Even the French Revolution was based on individuals. So I think we have this in common, which is not the case, for example, with Germany. Then we have some differences, and it has been also highlighted. We are much more in terms of economics protectionist and much more, let's say, we stick to the states, because in the history of France was a country with many different regions. It has been united by the states, and even the industry or the big, some big firms that have been launched by the state. So we have this state mind, and many good things in France have come from the state. So that's maybe the difference between France and the UK. And then we have also a difference, and maybe that will come to your other topic, which is a work on all the communitarism part, because culturally in the UK, you have this community-based society. That means that many people, if they are Pakistanis, Indian, they will live in their communities, and let's say the average British people, they are okay if the other people live apart and with a different way of life. In France, we have always this let's say laic state, and the concept that we are one national community. That means that even if you come from another country, if you, let's say, want to be French, or we don't recognize different community, you just have one national community, or we won't class people according to ethnic categories. For example, we say you are French or no, you're not French, and you are part of the national community. I think that's one of the let's say, big difference between France and the UK. But basically, I think there are many abuses, or let's say vision, because some tends to compare the UK with the US, and I think you have a very different history. And I think, for example, to import all the Black Lives Matters in the UK and to compare it with the US, it's a total silliness, because in the UK you didn't have a national apartheid in your country. You never had all the issue of the cops with black people and so on. So I think it's very stupid, and some are trying to do the same in France, but I think it's very stupid to try to compare the history of the UK with the one of the US, which is very different. You never had the issues that the US had.
Charles-Henri, I think that's very interesting, and it's an interesting segue to my next point, because in Europe, you referred to sort of the importation of various types of politics and political movements from the United States to the UK, and to perhaps a lesser extent France, and then a lesser extent still perhaps to other European countries. But we seem to have been, to an extent, infected, and I am going to use that word, infected, by a new form of left-wing politics that's sort of been imported from the United States, or should I say exported. I'm not quite sure how actively those in the US have been working to export it to the UK, but certainly there are those in the UK who have welcomed the US politics. And you mentioned Black Lives Matter, but there's others, in the Antifa movement and so on. People who have made a career out of highlighting the differences between us in society rather than the things that unite us. And the people who've made a career and often money and increased status out of forging identity politics, politics based on race, religion, gender, or what have you. And the other thing that perhaps we're seeing increasingly at the moment is what I referred to earlier, the cancel culture and the wokism. A lot of this seems to be coming from the US, and Prince Harry, of course, is in the US, busy talking about being woke. It's a word that doesn't sit easily with me, because you don't be woke, you're awake. But so even linguistically, I can't quite grasp it. But these are, in my view, damaging. And Robert, this is where I come back to, because this is relatively new, this form of political movement and advocatism in the UK. And, we've seen attempts to rewrite our history in universities. Statues have been torn down. And we see people who've got entirely valid concerns about immigration, about integration of immigrant communities, about the form of policing that we're seeing, and maybe sort of some inequitable policing, with people whose freedom of speech is being totally suppressed by the incredibly abusive sort of attacks on anybody who raises their head above the parapet and expresses any opinion that's different from those of the woke cancel culture sort of left-wing people. They're not the traditional left-wing sort of working class socialists of Great Britain in the past. This is a new thing. So I wonder how you, Robert, see that playing out here, whether you think it will fade away, as you sort of seem to think we've got enough resilience to deal with that, or whether you think you agree it's a new challenge.
Well, you're absolutely right to say that it's infectious. It's in a sense an infection. Of course, I co-authored a book with Dr. Neil McRae where we detailed this, called it Moralitis, a Cultural Virus. And this form of politics is, of course, put out there by the left to try and smash faith, family, flag, all the institutions that have held this country and other countries indeed together. Of course, it was believed amongst various communist activists that the reason why advanced capitalist countries, advanced industrial countries didn't accept communism, as of course they had predicted was inevitable as per theories of Karl Marx, was because of the working classes' attachment to institutions and their what communists saw as their simple beliefs. And this has sort of come largely from the United States, where it's infected their university system. Of course, there's other theorists that have been active in Europe, such as Gramsci. In America, it was Marcuse. But in a sense, it's found fertile ground in Britain, as in a sense is nothing new. George Orwell saw this characteristic amongst the left and wrote about it in 1984, an Animal Farm, and saw how they tried to manipulate language, how they tried to shut down debate. This is something which has always been a part of their political tactics. And the British, being sort of polite and welcoming, have gone along with this. Of course, some people just ape what's happening in America, which is, in a sense, nothing new. America is such a dominant culture that people have always copied what's happened in America and taken up what's happening there and brought it across. If America sneezes, Britain catches a cold, politically as well as economically. In a sense, it's found fertile ground in the UK because there is this long tradition. This is why it's very interesting to have a guest on from France, Charles-Henri, because French intellectuals would never, ever think of condemning their own country or talking bad about France or advocating that France give up its nuclear weapons. That's just would not enter their psyche. British intellectuals have always wanted to talk down about their country, of course, because it has a reason for doing so, because they want to differentiate themselves from the lower orders. And this is something that's very prevalent in British politics. We have, that's why they were so attracted to the European Union, because it's this presented itself as some internationalist class, and those who are elites are very attracted to woke politics because, of course, it's all about talking down to the common man or woman and mocking their simplistic, as they would say, simplistic notions, is that they support the royal family, they support our faith. They support our family institutions and our flag, and they're wedded to their community. So this is something which has been a part of British politics for decades, if not even centuries, possibly because we never had a full revolution. The revolution we did have in the 1640s was quickly sort of overturned, and then Britain entered a sort of period of politics where it evolved. Now we have a situation where once it was the case that people could show their wealth by talking about how they would go on a cruise, by wearing the right watch, by being able to speak French, by enjoying the trappings of wealth. And now, of course, people don't have that. There's so much prosperity, there's so much understanding. And for people to show off their wealth, they've exchanged material currency for moral currency. The woke brigade, which are mainly establishment people, this is not the common people, are mainly people who are trying to show how socially sophisticated they are. And it's a way of it's conspicuous consumption, which again is nothing new in Britain. Once people showed off their conspicuous consumption by owning a car or going on a cruise. Now everybody almost owns a car, and we can all, if we save up and work hard, we can also get a cruise. But of course, only the super rich and super educated can talk about woke politics and take political positions which make absolutely no sense, such as being pro-immigration, pro-gay rights, pro-transgender, pro-feminism, all things which in a sense are largely, to some degree, mutually exclusive, because there's inherent contradictions. If we open up to immigration, we may find that we're taking in people who are not so open to gay rights, for instance, or transgenderism. And feminism is actually at odds with transgenderism. It's actually completely the opposite. But to show your sophistication, you have to talk this nonsense. And they've managed to dominate the media, but they don't represent the ordinary people. So these people tearing down statues, partly they've seen it in America and it just infects them. Partly, this is nothing new. It's no different to the Oxford Union decades ago voting controversially that they wouldn't fight for king and country. And they're still talking the same old drivel. But eventually, these students will grow up.
I take all that, but I'm going to take a slightly different approach. You say they talk nonsense and it makes no sense, but you know, we can't, on the centre right, we're not going to get very far if we simply condemn them as talking nonsense and talking no sense. In my view, one has to put up a counterbalance, a counter argument, a counter narrative, and the problem is, as I see it, that the left are winning that battle. Their narrative is dominating. The identity politics supported by wokism and cancel culture are dominating. The centre-right are losing the discussion, the debate, because we're not really entering it. If I may, they're dominating the airwaves, they're dominating the debate because they're cancelling everybody else. But if that was enough to give them victory, we wouldn't have voted for Brexit. People wouldn't have voted for the Conservative government on what was perceived as a right-wing ticket in the 2019 general election. And the Conservatives are perhaps, we're going to find out very shortly, going to take Hartlepool, a Labour heartland. The people do not want this. The more they go on about it, and the more absurd positions that the woke brigade take, the more they will undermine themselves, because normal people just want to get on with their lives. So I think they will be, to use Marxist terminology, their own gravediggers in the end. Robert, that may be, but you seem to be advocating doing nothing about it.
Oh no, I'm not someone I've been campaigning for this, but for 20 years I've been campaigning within the Conservative Party and without for socially conservative or culturally conservative, should we say, political viewpoints, and of course for Brexit. And so I've been fighting this battle very hard. But the point is that the more these people go on and try and cancel people, the more there will be a reaction. And the more people like me and perhaps others will come to the fore, because there's always in society a reaction. And in our book, Moralitis, a Cultural Virus, we call them antibodies. The more this infection spreads, the more society will produce people that will push back and say, for instance, with the European Union, one of those people was yourself, Nigel Farage. We see Lawrence Fox coming to the fore, and there's a whole host of institutions now and campaign groups, the Free Speech Union, who are there to take on.
You know, yes, you talk about people coming up and pushing back, but that's what this is all about.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Hear me out, and then we'll go to Charles-Henri. It's about pushing back. People are sick and tired of the policing that we see that's inequitable. You know, there was a time when police, I used to be a police officer 25 years ago, and if I had expressed publicly in uniform a political opinion or sided with a political protest or demonstration, I'd have been out of a job. Now,
and the police now are a joke. You know, they are mocked.
Robert,
they are mocked, not taken seriously. No wonder crime is running rampant, knife crime.
There was a time when policing was fair and equitable, and people are tired of it not being fair and equitable. However, there are institutional, systemic problems as to why that is not simple to change. And I'm going to throw this out there for a future debate, but parties like the Reform Party that stand up for these things don't have any plan for this. They say it's not good enough, not good enough, not good enough. But I referred at the beginning to the fact that perhaps government, politics, political parties lack strategic acumen, lack planning, lack policies. They like the headline grabbing things, but they don't go any further. And I would suggest that that's part of the problem, and why, for the first time perhaps in centuries, the assumption that Britain can just sort of pretty much rely on its cultural resilience is a dangerous assumption. But Charles-Henri, you've heard Robert talk, you've heard me talk. What are your views on what's been said?
It's very interesting. I think you're right. It's not only to blame or to say it's bad that is happening. I think it's a broader issue. I would say it's not all the left wing. It's just one part of the left wing, which is this wokism. And I think it can be fought back by education. We have an expression here in French, which is the national novel. And I think it's very important because basically what the woke movement wants to do, they want you to hate your own country. And I think that the best, let's say, vaccination is to be proud of your country, to be proud of your history. When you look at some movement in the UK that wanted to topple the Churchill statue, I mean, it's totally crazy when you know what Churchill means in the UK history with the fight against the Nazis, and you consider yourself normally left people and so on to fight against the Nazi. It was let's say one of the best part, let's say, of the British history. So it's totally crazy. Of course, it's less important in France. I think maybe 10 years before us, but some people are also trying to import that. And we see, for example, it will be, in May the 5th, 200 years of the death of Napoleon Bonaparte. I know we have some different opinion maybe about it, but it's a very glorious and important people in the history of France. And normally every country would celebrate if it was someone from his country, someone like Napoleon that have won 50 battles, that have created the Bank of France. All the main institutions that are still in the French institution come from Napoleon. If you look at the Paris station, for example, you have 50 metro station linked to the Napoleon history. If you walk through the Paris street, you will have many monuments, many battles, many things linked to France. And if you want to cancel it, it's totally crazy. You have to face, let's say, the dark side maybe of the history. But I think the first thing you have to do, above all, when you have an important part of immigration in your country, is to do the contrary, is to tell this national novel and to teach people why they have to be proud to be part of this country. And I think it's the same in the UK. I think maybe you can win this battle through education, to have this national novel and to explain all the great things that the UK has done in the history, or all the main important characters and people that you had in your history that have made actually the country that you are enjoying nowadays. So I think it will be definitely through education, through let's say a cultural fight.
Charles-Henri, I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of one of the key elements of society that has a powerful influence here in ensuring people get a good, rounded, objective opinion of things and view of things, and that is education. We'll be touching on education in a future discussion, but of course, one thing that a lot of people in this country would argue is that the left have taken over education. It is in schools in which wokism is being brought in, the identity culture and so on. A mother the other day told me that her 14-year-old son had been, he's got to make decisions about his future, his future subjects. And on religious education, he was asked by his religious education teacher whether he was going to take religious education. He said no, and because there's a lot of writing and he doesn't enjoy writing, he finds writing difficult. And the teacher in front of the class said, "Rubbish, that's not the reason. The reason is you're a racist." And that's for a 14-year-old. Now, how do you cope with things like that in school? You know, to my mind, a teacher like that should be disciplined. It's entirely unacceptable. But this is the sort of thing that's going on in our primary schools, our secondary schools, our colleges, and our universities. And it is systemic. So it's a future conversation in a future discussion that we'll be holding. But one question before we finish, and it really goes back to Robert's point about how resilient the sort of traditions and the institutions of the UK are. I mean, we've got various political parties calling for major reforms of some of our institutions, our parliamentary institutions, the House of Lords, for example, without any concrete specific proposals. But even those calls sort of undermine the integrity of those institutions unless there is a constructive proposal put on the table around which constructive, sensible debate can be had. But it's also our laws, and the laws, quite rightly, can't just be overturned like this. And in the UK, we have laws, and I wonder what you think of this, both of you. We have laws that make exceptions for foreign cultures. Statues are pulled down and so on, and a lot of that is driven by Black Lives Matter and the slavery thing, with total disregard for the fact that yes, the UK was involved in slavery, but the UK brought around the global abolition, legal abolition of slavery. But slavery was around long before that. The Romans, the Greeks, African tribal leaders sold people to other African tribal leaders. It's still going on in some countries like sort of Afghanistan and so on. So, this isn't a British thing, yet all of the rest of it seems to be forgotten. It's out of context. But we see that happening. And has that been encouraged by the legal situation in which perhaps foreign cultures have been given more protection under British law than British history, traditions and cultures? I'll give you an example. What about halal slaughter? The law in this country says very clearly animals should be stunned before slaughter, with an exception that Muslims and Jews do not have to do that. Now, there is nothing in either the Jewish religious books or the Islamic Muslim religious books that states that it is a religious requirement. It's about the traditional aspects of clean meat. And they talk about bleeding meat, not the stunning side of it. So creating those exceptions under law for certain cultures, traditions, and so on, that are foreign to our own, not necessarily better or worse, just different. When we create those exceptions under law, where does that lead us? Go to Charles-Henri first this time.
Yeah, no, I mean, I will be very short on that one. Normally you don't have to have any exception if you think you are equal citizen. The law is the same for everyone, and you must abide by the law wherever you come from. If you don't like the law of a country, you don't come to a country. It's basically the same, and it will be the same for a French that will go to live in a foreign country. If you don't have, for example, I don't like the laws of Arabia Saudi, I won't go to live there. So normally when you are a country, you abide by the law, and the law should be the same for everyone. That's one of the principles of equality, of respect. So I would say the law should be the same for everyone. And if you don't like the law in one country, you just don't go to live to that country.
Mm-hmm. Robert, what do you think?
Well, absolutely. But the purpose is, of course, to divide us. I'll explain why. What we need to see some immediate changes is the abolition of the Equalities Act and of Section 127 of the Communications Act, which is the grounds for prosecuting people for saying the wrong thing on Facebook or Twitter or either any means electronically that have the wrong opinion. It gives the state way too much power to police what we think and what we say, and that needs to be overturned. Those rules need to be abolished. And in education, we need to start promoting our national identity and celebrating that again as well, which is something we used to do and something we need to do again. And we need to make sure that free speech is restored. At the moment, it's been taken away. If we have free speech, we know we win. So that's the big battle. But of course, remember that after all those years of communism and indoctrination, the people of Eastern Europe are, of course, still far more religious. In a sense, they're indoctrinated against this virus, this communist virus that's been spreading. But I'd sort of say this: it's evolved now, and things are quite different. Of course, these attacks on our culture did originally come from the left. But I would say now, who actually benefits from this, and why is it being promoted so much? And I would say that actually this has, in a sense, defeated the traditional left. And when did this all begin? Really, a lot of this began in 2011, all this obsession with race, when, of course, there was the Occupy Wall Street protests. And it was very important the corporations would see, because they're the ones who benefit from this, to distract people's attention from the failures of just a few years ago, in 2008, where there was the financial crash and literally billions being pumped into the financial sector and taxpayers underwriting the super rich. Mm-hmm. And they had to distract people. And now what is the obsession of the left? Do they want any economic change? Is there anything substantial that the left are saying? No, it's all about should transgender men have or women, however they define themselves, have the right to use the bathroom of the opposite gender. It's actually, the left has actually completely destroyed itself, or been destroyed actually, by what is, in a sense, I would see it as a corporate plot, because Black Lives Matter, which is there to racially divide people, is of course supported by the biggest corporations in the world. It is £1 billion, Black Lives Matter Incorporated, it's £1 billion industry. It's received over $1 billion in donations from the biggest companies, biggest corporations in the world. Why is that? I would argue that companies like Amazon and other companies, well, they know that one of the key determinants of whether their workforce will unionize or not is if they are ethnically diverse. If their workforce doesn't see themselves as people who want a better deal from the corporation they work for, if they are divided ethnically and culturally, they are less likely to unite. And that's one reason, I think, why big business is putting money into this. It's about doing over, I would say, the little man. And of course, it's when there's riots in America and Black Lives Matter are burning down cities, they are burning out the small traders. They're not burning down big corporations who are no doubt insured and can come back. And there's another matter as well. The more, this is very important, if I may, the more ethnically diverse people are, and then the more there is this understanding that we mustn't, white people must be nicer to black people. The left are again not asking for anything substantial. They're chasing their own tail, wondering if they're allowed to have an opinion or not, whether their opinion is actually driven by by being a part of the patriarchy or some benefit through being white. But one of the main reasons I would argue, this is very important, is that I think they want more diversity, because then we would be more willing to accept immigration from around the world, which enables more cheap labour, which enables companies to pay their workers less. And that's why this is, in a sense, no longer the preserve of the left. This is being driven by corporations who are rent-seeking businesses that just want to extract more. I'm very pro-capitalist, but that needs to be a competitive market, not rent-seeking monopolies who have taken control of the public debate and are pumping money into these pride movements, these Starbucks, billion-pound industry, paying no tax. Don't look at how they're paying no tax. They want you to focus on how they're supporting the mermaids and transgender children, and they pay money to Black Lives Matter. They are there to divide us, not unite us. We need to understand what's driving this and where this is all coming from, and how the left, in a sense, have been taken for a ride. They have actually managed to destroy themselves. They are no longer relevant.
Look, I'm actually going to briefly disagree. I'm going to say, well, it might be partly that, but I actually think that corporate organizations are kowtowing to the identity politics, wokism type agenda in the United States and in the UK, because that is the dominant agenda. That is the one.
Bottom line. It aids their bottom line.
That's the one that the government is pursuing in law and in policy, in all areas, in education, in healthcare, and everything else. But anyway, we must leave it there.
I have to leave you.
We'll carry on these debates. We've got another series. There are a lot of topics that we can delve into specifically there. I'd be very happy if either or both of you would come back on to maybe delve into one of the two of these more specifically, because we've got to end now. Can't go on all night. I'd like to thank you both very much for participating in this first of our BRITPAC discussions. May there be many more. Thank you.